technique I sort of developed out of necessity. So one of the big things I used to do was pack Huawei 4G, 5G broadband type kit. And the way a lot of this kit works is it's just some blank board with no interfaces or anything on it besides blinky lights. And what's really, really difficult about these types of devices is that if you have something like an Xbox or a computer, it's quite intuitive of how you interact with it. Because at the end of the day, a computer is a computer. Like everything from your washing machine to your mobile phone to a Windows laptop operates under the same mathematical, physical, and computing principles as anything else. So this was very much something I developed, and is going to give a very high, I sort of like a high level overview with a bit of tech thrown in to describe what we do, or what I do, and what I've developed to just go after IoT devices through sort of backdooring firmware is probably the best way to put it. Most recently, even though I developed this when I was doing a lot of work at Huawei, most recently I've used it to go after ICS type environments. So going from the internet to being able to affect and cause, I don't know, things like explosions, or cause things like the grid to misalign or go out of phase. Oops. So the first thing I'm going to describe is that this is a very typical high-level network overview of what a ICS system would look like. You have a controller network in the middle, which is typically the main backbone communication that would be sitting at some site. Then you would have some physical networks on the outside, and these are things that actually either actuate something in a factory or monitor things like phase alignment with different grid systems, or these things measure the output of a generator or a DC power supply, such as a solar panel or something like that. And always somewhere along the line, this actual site is going to be connected back to the corporate network. And what I've seen quite a lot most recently, especially more recently, is a lot of these things have IoT sort of tacked on at the edge, and it's normally either an environmental control system, some monitoring system, or IP cameras. Now, I'm going to focus on IP cameras on this talk, but the entire point, the entire thing I only care about in this is I want to go from the outside, from this IoT sitting on the internet, to the inside, which is affecting the physical system. So this is a very high level overview of the, I guess, software that typically sits on an IoT device. And I say IoT, but like I said before, it's exactly the same as every other computer. On the right-hand side, you've got an internal and external interface, whether or not it's 5G, 4G, Ethernet, something along those lines. Then you have some sort of driver that sits in the middle, and the driver's job is to convert all of that data going from the actual physical hardware to the kernel that's then able to communicate with software. And this software typically is what we actually think about when you're hacking or exploiting stuff. So this is things like HTTP servers, FTP servers, and SSH servers. So all you need to think about with IoT devices is all they do is take something from an internal, external interface, put it through a driver, put it through the kernel, up to software. This software does something with it and then sends it back out on the same interface or a different interface. And that's all IoT devices do. They don't do anything more interesting than that. And to be honest, that's all that computers do. So remember, we're very interested in these services, but what we want to do in this talk is go from a HTTP interface through an SSH interface that we're going to backdoor. And we're going to do that by actually ripping off the firmware. So before was the software perspective of IoT devices, and this is, I guess, this is the hardware overview of IoT devices. In the hardware aspect, you've got the same thing. You've got interfaces on the right-hand side. You've got controllers. So this is the thing that the drivers are typically going to be communicating with. These are things that are doing the physical conversion from electrical signals to digital signals. You have some CPU, you have some RAM for the place for the processors to do some work, and you typically have NVRAM or some sort of storage that's able to load the images up from firmware in the initial instance. So this is a board that I grabbed. So I'm also going to demonstrate with some sort of pictures I've taken today. So this is a board I grabbed out of my cupboard. And we're just going to go through. The first thing is to always identify what's on the board. So in the middle, we can see there's some sort of CPU. And we need to know all of these things for various reasons that will become apparent. So the first thing is we're going to identify the CPU. We can actually just look up the codes and find out that this is a Broadcom chipset. This is a 40 nanometer, bunch of stuff, but it's going to be some sort of system on chip that we will need to know to be able to recompile our firmware into its architecture. The next thing we're going to actually have a look at, and this is probably the most important bit of this entire operation, is finding out where the physical hardware memory lives. Because what we're interested in is essentially just reinstalling this IoT device, but with our own firmware on top of it. So we need to know, like I said before, we need to know the CPU architecture, and we need to know the kernel, and maybe a little bit about the hardware itself. So what we typically do as well is identify these NVRAM, and all you need to do really, typically or most often, is just get the board, have a look at all of these different chipsets that sit all here and there, and what you're doing is reading off these codes, and you just use Google to try and figure out which each little aspects of these things are. I believe on this board that I grabbed out, I think the bottom one is an eMMC memory card that's 4 GB big, and the thing on the top is flash memory. Now, this is essentially what we're going to be targeting in this type of attack. We're going to be trying to rewrite the flash memory by building our own firmware. The next thing we're just going to have a quick look at is RAM. If you ever get a board and you see things that are really square, it's always RAM. And obviously, RAM is just there as a storage space for the CPU. This is, again, the device description that's quite easy to get. The next thing we have a look at as well is internal and external interfaces, because typically the external interface is sitting on either some SATCOM network or it's sitting on a 4G or 3G network. And we're going to remember, we're always trying to, from this type of perspective, we're always trying to go from the external interface to have some sort of command and control that allows us to talk to the internal interface. We're basically trying to install our own bridge by overtaking other IoT devices in the network. And on the board, we can see these at the top. This one, I think it was a DVTV camera. So you can see at the top right, there's a coaxial cable and a bunch of transmission lines that are able to do a bunch of conversion, but it's not really important. The next thing we'll see here on the board is a bunch of controllers. You'll have a bunch of amplifiers and a bunch of other power converters here. But remember, everything about this attack is all we want to do is have some IoT device we can log into, go from the internal to external interface, get something in RAM that we control, and then get back out to the external interface again. That's all we care about. We don't care about anything else. And remember, this is all about targeting and overwriting the NVRAM. Now, there are a couple of different ways you can do this for IoT devices. I mean, I went through a very quick description of a board that I just did some demos with. One attack you could do is you could physically desolder the chips off these boards, rewrite the firmware, put it back on the chip, and then put the chip back on the board. Now, for a remote attack over the internet, that's not really a viable solution. However, most people will probably know that when you have an IoT device, there's going to be some sort of HTTP web page with a please upload your new firmware to this device. This is just my Now TV hub. There's no firmware openly available, but if you wanted to perform this attack, you could probably get the Now TV hub, pull the chip off in a destructive way, read the firmware, get their own firmware, and you can modify it, and then you should be able to upload it from here. And now this entire thing is predicated on you need to be able to log into the device in some way. And this is something I've done that's quite common. So the methodology of the attack works like this. What we're going to do is we're going to attempt to log into the IoT device. If you can't log into it, if you can't log into that HTTP or some sort of the management interface, there's not really a lot you can do. Then we're going to try and find out the type and version. Because when I scan a network and I see an open HTTP port, I don't know what the device is. I just log into it and it'll probably give a few brief descriptions. I need this because I either need to go out and buy the device to be able to rip off the firmware, or I need to be able to look on Google and see if there's anywhere that it's publicly available. Then the next thing, obviously, is we want to grab a copy of good known firmware through either of the techniques I just described. We're going to unpack the file system. These bits of firmware are just blobs of information, but we're going to unpack it in some way that has some meaning. We're going to identify the processor architecture. We can either do that through pictures or we can read binaries off the board. We're going to compile a vulnerable version of SSH. Well, I say vulnerable, it's not a vulnerable version of SSH. We're just going to compile our own SSH server, rewrite some firewall rules on the flash, and we're going to listen on a port, so it starts up at the beginning of when PID1 gets entered, because these things are almost always Linux-based systems. And what we're going to see is once we've re-uploaded this firmware, we're going to see something either listening on port 22 or another port that we know we have access to. Then we're going to repack the file system, because these things are just folders on your computer. We're going to upload it to the device via the interface, most likely HTTP, as I demonstrated before, and then we're going to log into our backdoor. So what we're going to do every time, compile an SSH server, put it in some firmware we've downloaded off the internet, log into an IoT device, we're just going to click upload. The device I'm going to use for this, so I haven't actually got this, I'm just using this as a demonstration because TP-Link are quite good at providing firmware. I also didn't launch like a end-to-end attack on my own devices, because this can be a bit destructive and it costs quite a lot of money to do this over and over again. And I don't have that much money, because some of the, like, even though I say IoT devices, these things can still cost a few £100s. If you're a business and you're doing this as part of a test, it might be viable. If I'm doing it on my own for fun, it's not quite so viable. So TP-Link are really, really good because they often provide firmware for you to actually have a look at and download, and actually just upload it through the interface that I demonstrated before. What's really nice about this is, one thing you've got to be very, very careful of as well is when you have the firmware, you can either have the entire blob of firmware, upload it via the HTTP interface, and it gets unpacked and put into various locations on the board. Or you can have it and it takes some sort of differential approach. So instead of downloading the entire firmware update, it'll say, oh, these are the updates this time, and it just builds on what that was there last time. Downloading the entire binary blob, if you can, is easier to work with, because you don't need to sort of stage things in an incremental way. One of the best ways to actually look for this type of thing is if you see the file sizes of the firmware increasing with versions, that's a very, very good indicator that it's not an incremental update. This normally means that you're taking an entire firmware image and uploading the entire thing every time. What's interesting about this as well is that one of the things that happened is there was a CVE posted on this device. I'm not sure if it was remote code execution or just a denial of service vulnerability, but there was one last year. And it's interesting to sort of just bring up, because when we think about exploitation, we're very much thinking about, we want to either send some packet into the network that causes some memory corruption to happen, or causes some web interface or logical vulnerability, which means we can then read it and access it. And normally what we're doing here is attacking the software on here. So we're not actually like attacking the kernel or the drivers themselves. We're attacking the server that's running on the IoT device, much like how an Apache server runs on a Linux machine. But anyway, I'm going to presume that everyone here knows how to unzip a file. And I'm just going to show you the steps that I take to do this. So the first things first, you'll download typically a zip file. You'll get a zip file onto your local machine. You'll be able to see that there's going to be some sort of binary blob that's just sitting there in in your directory. That's what we're going to analyze. So we start with this firmware binary, just some monolithic blob of stuff. One of my favorite tools to use is binwalk. Now, binwalk, what it will do is it'll have a look through the file, and it'll see if it can find any interesting offsets and any interesting strings. If you just pack a bunch of data together, it tries to have a look through to see if you can unpack it. What's interesting about this is we see things like U-boot and JFFS2. Now, JFFS2 stands for Journaling Flash File System 2, which is a non-writable, a read-only version of a file system that is almost always used with flash memory. So that's a very, very good indication that we have found the file system we want to be adding our own backdoor to. So this is what we have now. We have a firmware blob. We've gone from a firmware blob and we've gone to a bunch of headers and stuff on the top, and this JFFS2 file system that's what we're interested in the bottom. The next thing I'm going to do is essentially just break it into two. I'm going to rip out that JFFS2 file system so we can actually manipulate that. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the trusty convert and copy. We're going to use the DD command. We're going to just go to whatever offset that was it started in the file, and we're just going to cut it out. We're just going to take the whole thing out. And we're going to run file on it. And if we run file and it says that this is a JFFS2 binary, then it's a very good indication that you've done it correctly. Next thing we're going to have a look at is actually copying, sorry, so we've done, so what we've done in the first instance is we took out the JFS2 file system, but we're also going to take out the beginning bit of the headers, because what we want to do is we want to rewrite the JFS2 file system, but keep all that stuff that was there originally, and then we're going to glue it back together. So what we're going to do again here, as I said, we're going to copy not just the JFS2 file system, but all the headers and stuff out. We're just going to shard it into 2 bits. So what we have at the end of it is all the headers, bootloaders and stuff, and the file system on the left-hand side. Next thing we're going to do, and this is always a really good indication, and it's a bit trivial, but it's just to make sure you understand it, is we're going to cat the first bit of the file system and the second bit of the file system. We're going to glue them back together. And we're going to glue them back together and ensure that the checksums match. If the checksums match after if you've opened everything up and you've repacked it and you've put it back together and the checksums match, then at least makes you understand that you've got a repeatable process. So I know how to unpack stuff, I know how to open it, I know how to put it back together. And once I've put it back together, I know that whenever I put something there, if it matches the kernel version, if it matches the architecture that I'm interested in, it should work. Now, this is a bit shooting in the dark. So always try these types of techniques on your own devices first. Don't just start bricking random customers' devices. I've seen people do that. It's never a good idea. But this is what you would be doing. So what we have now is we have our recreated file system. We have our recreated binary or firmware image on the left. We haven't modified it yet. And we have our binary on the right. And we can verify that both of those things are identical files. The next thing we're going to do, you can also do this with binwalk itself. So binwalk also supports a flag where you put binwalk-e and it'll go through and it'll recursively unpack as many file systems as it can. Now that doesn't always work because some of these can be proprietary. It might get different bits wrong, but it's good in about 80 to 90% of cases. So if you just want to go and grab a bunch of passwords for devices, or you want to go and find out a bunch of firmware and start reverse engineering an IT devices, just go grab the firmware, run binwalk-e on it, and it's probably going to spit out something that's quite interesting. As you can see, this is the extracted folder that's got all of those file systems in it. The next thing we're going to do in preparation is, now we know we have this JFS2 file system, we're going to go and install a bunch of tools that allow us to work with what's called memory technology devices, generally NVRAM, and JFS2 itself. This is just sort of preparation. And then what we're going to do, so the next thing we're going to do is we have this JFS2 file system, as I demonstrated before, and we're going to use the tool called JFS2 Reader on it. And when we run a JFS2 reader on a JFS2 file system, we get a bunch of these aren't unpacking. This is just telling us what's in that binary. It's going to give us a way that we can verify stuff a bit later. So we do this, and we can actually see that there's starting to be a file system structure that's occurring. So on my screen at the moment, so you can see binaries that exist in bin. Now, remember, this isn't binaries on my system. This is that firmware blob that we're actually reading. Next thing, stuff. We've got these 2 shards. We've got the headers, bootloaders and stuff on the right. We've got the file system on the left, and we've pushed it into the JFS2 reader, and it's spit out saying, I recognize this file. There is some file system here that you can read. What's really, really good about Linux as well is that you can actually use what's called an MTD block 0. So when we loaded all those kernel modules before that I shown, is it will create this /dev/MTD block 0, which is a loopback NVRAM interface that you can copy things onto for working with things like JFS2 and SquashFS and a bunch of other technologies. So what we do now is we have this file that we extracted. I'm going to copy it onto /dev/MTD block. What that's going to allow us to do from here is to mount it. We can now mount it as we can mount any other file system. So we can create this JFS2 file system, have a look in it, and it's actually starting to look a lot like a typical Linux file system. It's going to be stripped down a lot because, remember, this is an IoT device. It's not going to be massive. It's only going to have what's absolute requisite in there. But we can actually have a look in the bin file system, and we can see that there are quite interesting amounts of binaries. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put our binary in here, and then we're going to call it from within the same firmware. Because remember, computers and Linux is just about having binaries in the right place and running scripts to start them. That's the only thing we're going to do. We know we can access the binaries. We're going to put our own binary in here, and then we're going to put a script in the correct location, and it's just going to run our server. What we have now is the file system. We've copied it to the MTD block, and then we're going to have a look in the temp.jffs2 directory, which we have just done, and we're going to start replacing stuff. Now, there's a few bits of enumeration we need to do here. So I said before, we need to figure out what the actual architecture is. And what we do is we just run file on one of these binaries that already exists. And we can see that it's a MIPS version 2 ELF32 binary, which means that it should be relatively simple to compile some firmware, compile some software against that version. We're also going to have a look around for passwords. So remember, it's got an etc password file. I ran it through Hashcat and it was root. Now, this doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be the password that you can log into that HTTP server with, but in some circumstances, you might fall into a low privilege context. And if we know the password already for every single device out there, it makes it a lot easier for us to have move around and modify things. We may even want to change this ourselves. We may even want to actually overwrite this file and change the default password on the device. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to start compiling and copying different binaries. So as I showed you there in the bin directory, there's already a bunch of stuff there that's got MIPS in it. And these binaries are going to be things like HTTP servers, because remember, when we actually visited that web page, there has to be a server on that device that is serving you those web pages. That is going to be a MIPS compiled binary that sits on the IoT device. So we need to make sure that we know the kernel version, or at least close enough. It doesn't need to be perfect, and we need to know generally the architecture. Now, what I like to do is I like to use the oldest possible kernel that's going to work, or the oldest possible version of the architecture, because newer architectures have newer instructions and are backwards compatible with older architectures. But if I compile something that's too new for the IoT device, an IoT device is typically a really old, it's not going to work. So what I will do is find that MIPS. I will set this tool up called Crosstallng. I will say I want to have an old version of the Linux kernel that I know is supportable, and I'll have an older version of MIPS. And I can set this up here. I can just download this tool. I can set up all the parameters. And when I click save and click compile, it's just going to spit out the tool chains that are of interest to me. This is me just using Crosstallng to build the tool chains. This is going to pump out a bunch of things like compilers, linkers, assemblers, just things like GCC we typically use and see on Linux systems. After we've done that, we're now going to have this MIPS version of GCC on our system. And we're going to be able to use this MIPS version of GCC to compile software that we download or software that we write ourselves for that IoT device. I now know, because I've matched up the kernel version and I've matched up the actual compiler architecture, that if I compile a binary and I put it on that IoT device, it should run. It should run under that architecture, and it should be compatible with the ABI of that exact kernel version that we're looking at. I also like to link things statically. I don't actually know what libraries prior to running this device that are actually going to exist on the device. All I know is that that kernel is supported by a certain amount of system calls and hardware interfaces. I don't know if the regular version of libc is going to sit there. I don't know if ulibc is going to be there. So what I normally do is I just statically compile everything. It makes it a really big binary. So you have to be a bit careful that when you create your own firmware image, you don't go over the image size of the actual device, because it might reject you, or you just might brick the thing. So you have to be very careful of that. However, when I saw before, I think it had a couple of gigs sitting around in its memory. And if it's got a couple of gigs sitting around in its memory, I'm probably going to be able to make some couple of megabyte modification to the firmware without it freaking out. Another thing that's quite annoying is that sometimes for typical Linux compilation, you're going to have a bunch of other tools. Zlib's one that always gives me a problem. So Zlib's just going to exist on your device anyway for just doing normal compilation. If you're doing it for IoT devices and foreign architectures, you're going to have to download Zlib itself or another library and compile it, and then probably statically link it itself. So all we're doing is we're just trying to get off server, which was going to be dropped by SSH, just to compile for that kernel and compile for that architecture. And we're going to do it in the way that we know is going to work. We're going to use old versions of MIPS. We're going to use older versions of the kernel. We're going to statically link everything. And then we have to say which architecture we're targeting. Most often we also say the host. So we say we're an x86 host and we're compiling this for a MIPS32, I think it was Little Endian architecture. And this will actually produce a Dropbear executable. Now remember, Dropbear is just an SSH server, a really cut down version of an SSH server. And we can run a file on it and we can see that it's a MIPS32 binary, as was very similar to the one that we actually looked at in the actual, that already exists in the binary directories on the device. What's interesting as well is we can also run this under QEMU. So this is just the version strings. This is verifying that we can actually run that statically linked MIPS binary that's targeted for that kernel. So that gives me some indication that yes, actually, this thing should work. That it's a good sign. So next steps, we're going to go and grab the Dropbear source code, the SSH server. We're going to cross-compile it from MIPS. We're going to pull in that zlib binary we've had previously. So that's where we are. We've got the source code. We've created this cross-compiled toolchain, and we're going to pull in any external libraries we require. Next, we're going to do is we're going to create a new directory because JFFS2 is a read-only file system. For the most part, it is. Because it's a read-only file system, we're going to create a new file system of our own and then repack that into the firmware image. So what I've done here is I've just created a new directory, and I'm just going to copy everything that was in the old file system into the new file system. And we can just verify that it exists. And then we're going to copy that version of Dropbear into, I've chosen the SBIN folder of here. We're going to copy that version of Dropbear into the SBIN folder. We're going to copy any startup scripts or firewall configurations we need to make. And we're going to copy them into the right direction on the OT device because we know how Linux runs and how it boots up. And once we've done that, we're going to, we're moving from TempFS to JFS2 to our new TempFS. So that's the current state we're in. But once we've done that, we've created this new file system. We're going to run a utility called makefs JFFS2, which is going to take that, it's going to take this folder and it's going to pack it back up into a JFFS2 version. Now you need to know things like whether or not the processor architecture is Little Endian. I said you needed to know a bit about the structure of the flash. You need to know a bit about the structure of the board. Most typically it's the flash because JFFS2 and things like UBFS get compiled down to very specific versions. You need to know what the page sizes are. You need to know if there's any padding. You need to know what the erase block size is for that bit of flash memory. These things you can, like I said, it's very easy to get this information if you have a copy of the device and you could just rip it off and have a look at the chipset and actually do all of this research prior online. This makes it very, very, very simple. But what we're going to do is run this tool, makefs JFS2, send in the parameters we're interested in, and we're going to output it to a new JFFS2 binary. And then we're going to run the reader, but on our new JFFS2 binary. And as we can see, Dropbear wasn't there before, but it is now. So this is telling me not only is that so we ran QEMU on it to verify that it works against MIPS. It was running. Now we know that it's actually in the file system itself. And when it's in this format, as I showed before, because we already know how to strip it apart and pack it back up again, we know the process to pack it back up again, and we know that it's the correct process because when we did it before, it perfectly matched the hash. So we're now at this point. We've taken the source code, cross-compiled it, copied the binaries out of it, we've put it through makefs JFS2, and we're just going to repack the image. I'm not going to go back over how to cat something. Cat's not that difficult to use, and I'm presuming that people saw me do it before. But what we're going to do, what we're going to have now is the old headers of the headers, bootloaders, and other stuff, and we're going to have the new JFS2 file system we've created. Sometimes this can get a bit finicky because you'll need to identify some checksums. For the most part, and most of the time I've done this, you don't actually have to worry about it too much. It will implicitly trust whatever you feed it. It just says, whatever you give me, I'll just stick on the device and it should work. You can argue about whether or not that's secure, but that's the way it works. Remember, once we've got the file in this format, we can just click upload the chosen file here, apply it. Once that update applies, either it will do a reboot straight away, most often, or we will have to wait for it to reset in some form or the other. Once this device comes back online, we're going to have some SSH server listing on a port that we know about that's configured either with a password we've inserted, or it's going to use a key that we've inserted. which is going to give us the ability to execute code, or because it's an SSH server, we're going to be able to forward traffic via the IoT device. Now, this is a whole lot of explanation. I've not even really mentioned the grid, but this is one case I've used it previously. So what we had, or what I was looking at, is I was asked to have a look at a particular facility, and it was very much existed in this form. There was some sort of SATCOM that was on the peripheral, and there were some IoT devices that existed with that SATCOM link. And now this was to allow people, when they're remotely trying to monitor the site, is to log in case the main internet line got cut. So there's always a backup way in. But it also had things like IP cameras people could read. It had monitoring stuff that people could go in and actually adjust. But what I did is I found some web server listening. I tried some default credentials based on some enumeration stuff I did based on, I think it was, I can't remember what it was, but I think it displayed you a HTTP login page and it told you what the device was. Once we know what the device was, we can go and find out what the default credentials are. First thing I look in when I log into some random HTTP server and it's an IoT device is where's the maintenance page and where's the upload button. That's what I'm really, really interested in. Then what I did is did exactly what I showed you before. I unpacked everything, the firmware. I repacked the firmware with my own drop bear SSH server. And once I did that, device came back online. There was an SSH server listening on port 22 that allowed me to then pivot into the controller network. Now remember, this is like an actual controller network that's controlling things like the factory, or it's controlling equipment that could potentially cause a lot of damage to people. So once we're in here, what we very often see is very, very outdated Linux and Windows servers. This is cybersecurity 15 to 20 years ago. This is Metasploit can still work on everything. You have to be very careful because knocking one of these devices over has the potential to kill someone, but it makes it a lot simpler once you get into this trusted part of the network, because we've always got this ability to forward traffic via the internet, which in this instance was over a SATCOM link, into the controller network. Once we're in the controller network, we want to jump to the physical network. Repeat the process. It's going to be a bunch of really old Linux machines, really old Windows machines, and IoT devices. If you're a malicious attacker, you could just keep installing software everywhere, and no one would ever be able to detect this. And the next thing I do is I say, what's better than one physical network? Two physical networks. So then we try and actually just spread laterally and go through different physical networks to see how far we can get and to see what's there. And what's really nice as well is once you're in the network, you're sort of in a trusted environment. I wouldn't say it's fully trusted because there is normally some sort of separation, but you're more trusted than just coming in from the internet on the outside. So then you can pivot to things like the corporate network and start doing more damage on that side of things. Because remember, this is just some facility that exists somewhere in the world that people are going to be using to monitor stuff, whether or not it's a gas pipeline, a factory, or a nuclear power station. And the final thing I like to do as well is take over other IoT devices. Now, what I do with other IoT devices, once we've gone to this context, is I might make the primary IoT device some SSH server, and I'll then set up another IoT device that will be a backup server that will only call back once a week or once a month. That'll be my backdoor into it if there's ever a detection on the first one. I've never had this attack detected before because things like logging tools just don't really exist for IoT devices. Like how would people install them? These things are really, really outdated. They're really, really low power and low performance, and it makes it much simpler to be able to sort of move around and have a look at things. After this was all well and done, this is what my access looked like. I was all over every bit of the network because an IoT device had a HTTP server with default credentials. I get asked quite often if this has ever happened in the real world. This actually happened with a fish tank in Las Vegas. Some people may know about this, but there was a fish tank in a lobby in a casino in Vegas, and it had a smart thermometer that was just connected to the internet. So it had access. It was touching the internal network, and it was touching the internet. And what they were able to do is to get down their own firmware onto this smart thermostat in the fish tank lobby. And then they went through the smart thermostat into the casino's back networks and started stealing loads of people's details and data. I don't think they directly robbed any money. That would have been quite cool at a casino. But it was just the fact that they had a smart thermostat that allowed them to get hacked in a casino. And the thing is, as I always say with people, there's always like 3 ways to stop this, or 3 really good ways to prevent this. Is network segregation. For a very long time, every time I do a test of somewhere, I do a red teaming exercise, there is never any network segregation for IoT devices. People, for some reason, just want them sitting on the same network. I have no idea why an IP camera even has to be connected to the internal network. Most often, these things are monitored by third-party external companies, never internally. So I always say to people, it's like, if you don't need it connected internally, don't have it connected internally. Change the password. If you have an IoT device, just change the password. I say if possible, because it's not always possible. Some of these devices don't allow you to change the password on them. You go and get a bunch of really cheap stuff from China. Sometimes you can change the password, sometimes you cannot. But if you can, make sure it's possible. And the final bit I always say is do due diligence. Now, for IoT security stuff, there's only really been standards that have been ratified within the past 12 months. The UK is actually moving to a scenario, or is actually enacting some legislation at the moment that will make it illegal to sell IoT devices to consumers in the UK unless they have some very basic checks, like it's a non-default password, because that's the one thing that is going to get me in almost every time. You've got a good policy for updating your devices, or at least you let people know when it goes end of life. And I can't remember what the third one is. So it's end of life, it's passwords, and you need to have some instant response. So if someone reports a bug to you, you need to have some process and plan in place to allow you to sort of deal with this. One thing I always say to people is, before buying 50,000 IP cameras for your sites around the world, just check one. Like just pay someone £5,000 to £10,000. Yeah, it's expensive, but if you're going to buy 50, 10,000 of these things, just make sure that these basic things are in place. There's a whole bunch of technology and security technology, such as eFuse memory, anti-fuse memory, secure boot, trusted boot, that do exist on Linux boxes and do exist on IT devices, but I rarely see them. I very, very rarely see it, because they're cheap and commodity. People don't want to be able to spending loads and loads of money on these really cheap devices to be able to monitor some site they've got, when all they want to do is spend 20 quid. So it sort of becomes a bit of a very high target. Now this attack has got me in quite a few times into different places. I just wanted to give you a very good broad overview of what it looked like, how I go about approaching the situation. And even though I love exploiting stuff, I love fuzzing stuff, and I love exploiting firmware binaries, I often don't need to, because I can just write my own firmware. Just think like a developer. If I needed access to this device, just write your own firmware, upload that. Doesn't always work, can be a bit finicky, but this was just a presentation on the high level overview.